Chapter 26. The question may be raised whether the epic or tragic mode of imitation is the higher. If the more refined art is the higher, and the more refined in every case is that which appeals to the better sort of audience, the art which imitates anything and everything is manifestly most unrefined. The audience is supposed to be too dull to comprehend unless something of their own is thrown in by the performers, who therefore indulge in restless movements. Bad flute players twist and twirl if they have to represent the quoit throw or hustle the coryphaeus when they perform the scylla. Tragedy, it is said, has this same defect. We may compare the opinion that the older actors entertained of their successors. Meniscus used to call Callipides ape on account of the extravagance of his action, and the same view was held of Pindarus. Tragic art, then, as a whole, stands to epic in the same relation as the younger to the elder actors. So we are told that epic poetry is addressed to a cultivated audience who do not need gesture, tragedy, to an inferior public. Being then unrefined, it is evidently the lower of the two. Now, in the first place, this censure attaches not to the poetic but to the histrionic art, for gesticulation may be equally overdone in epic recitation, as by Sosistratus, or in lyrical competition, as by Nicithius Theopuntian. Next, all action is not to be condemned any more than all dancing, but only that of bad performers. Such was the fault found in Callipides, as also in others of our own day, who are censured for representing degraded women. Again, tragedy, like epic poetry, produces its effect even without action. It reveals its power by mere reading. If, then, in all other respects it is superior, this fault, we say, is not inherent in it. And superior it is, because it has all the epic elements. It may even use the epic meter, with the music and spectacular effects as important accessories, and these produce the most vivid of pleasures. Further, it has vividness of impression in reading as well as in representation. Moreover, the art attains its end within narrower limits, for the concentrated effect is more pleasurable than one which is spread over a long time and so diluted. What, for example, would be the effect of the Oedipus of Sophocles if it were cast into a form as long as the Iliad? Once more, the epic imitation has less unity, as is shown by this, that any epic poem will furnish subjects for several tragedies. Thus, if the story adopted by the poet has a strict unity, it must either be concisely told and appear truncated, or, if it conform to the epic canon of length, it must seem weak and watery. Such length implies some loss of unity. If, the poem is constructed out of several actions, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have many such parts, each with a certain magnitude of its own. Yet these poems are as perfect as possible in structure. Each is, in the highest degree attainable, an imitation of a single action. If, then, tragedy is superior to epic poetry in all these respects and, moreover, fulfills its specific function better as an art, for each art ought to produce, not any chance pleasure, but the pleasure proper to it. As already stated, it plainly follows that tragedy is the higher art, as attaining its end more perfectly. Thus much may suffice concerning tragic and epic poetry in general, their several kinds and parts, with the number of each and their differences, the causes that make a poem good or bad, the objections of the critics and the answers to these objections.
Summary and reflection for Chapter 26.
In section 26 of the Poetics, Aristotle addresses the question of whether epic or tragic imitation is the higher form of art. He begins by considering the notion that refined art appeals to a better audience, and therefore, an art that imitates everything is considered unrefined. The argument is that the histrionic art, especially in tragedy, tends to be overdone with restless movements and gestures. The comparison is made between tragedy and epic, suggesting that epic poetry is addressed to a more cultivated audience that does not need overt gestures, making it a more refined art. Aristotle counters this argument by stating that the censure about excessive action does not apply to the poetic art itself, but rather to the histrionic performance. He contends that gesticulation can be overdone in various art forms, including epic recitation and lyrical competition. The fault lies not in all action, but in the execution by bad performers. He goes on to argue that tragedy, despite potential excessive action, is superior to epic poetry for several reasons. Tragedy incorporates all the elements of epic poetry, including the use of the epic meter, but adds music and spectacular effects as important accessories. The combination of these elements produces vivid and intense pleasures. Furthermore, tragedy achieves its effects both in representation and mere reading, making it superior in terms of vividness of impression. Aristotle highlights that tragedy attains its end within narrower limits, creating a more concentrated and pleasurable effect. He compares the potential effect of a long-form Oedipus of Sophocles to the Iliad, arguing that the concentrated nature of tragedy is more pleasurable. Additionally, he notes that epic poetry has less unity, often providing material for several tragedies. Tragedy, on the other hand, excels in structure, achieving a high degree of unity in imitating a single action. In conclusion, Aristotle contends that if tragedy surpasses epic poetry in all these respects, fulfills its specific function better, and achieves its end more perfectly, then tragedy is the higher art. This section concludes the discussion on tragic and epic poetry, covering various aspects such as their kinds, parts, causes of quality, objections by critics, and responses to those objections.
Practical exercises.
Writers. Concentrated storytelling. Write a short story that exemplifies the concentrated effect by focusing on a single action or event, creating a vivid and intense experience for the reader. Epic condensation. Take a story with epic proportions and condense it into a shorter format while preserving its unity. Reflect on how this changes the impact and pleasure of the narrative. Composers. Integrating music and spectacle, compose a musical piece that incorporates both epic and tragic elements, experimenting with how the addition of music and spectacle enhances the overall experience. Conveying intensity through music, compose a piece that reflects the concentrated and intense effects discussed by Aristotle, using musical elements to create a powerful impression. Dancers. Expressive choreography. Choreograph a dance that conveys the essence of a tragic or epic narrative, experimenting with movements that capture the emotions and intensity of the story. Symbolic movements. Create a dance piece that uses symbolic movements to represent a concentrated and intense narrative, exploring how movement can communicate a story without excessive action. Actors. Character exploration. Act out a scene that requires intense and vivid expression without relying on excessive gestures, exploring how subtle actions and emotions can convey a powerful narrative. Unity in performance. Perform a scene from a tragic play, focusing on achieving unity in your performance by conveying a single, concentrated action or emotion throughout the scene. These exercises encourage artists to explore the concepts discussed by Aristotle, such as the concentrated effect, vividness of impression, and the balance between action and expression in their respective art forms.